this is the Provoked Prawn, here with a detailed review of the Lian Li Lancool 207, which as you can see I've crafted here with the Lian Li Hydroshift all-in-one cooler, but I've also built in this twice, because I also wanted to see what it would look like with a stealth setup with Noctua's Chromax black fans. Doing this has enabled me to find a few different interesting quirks to the case, so I want to talk to you about the problems that I found and the things of interest along the way and the highlights of it. I found one, for example, when trying to remove the standard pre-installed fans and swapping them out for two 140mm Noctua Chromax black fans, where there is some little issues that you need to be aware of. But obviously lots of other things to consider, including thermal testing and the standard setup, because not everyone's going to want to swap the fans out. So to start with, I'm just going to cover the points of interest about this case and the things that make it stand out. It has a pretty good value for money considering what's included here, with some interesting design quirks. This is pitched as ATX reinvented. The power supply is now at the front, for example, and there's this extension cable here that allows you to plug your power supply cable in at the back still. When you remove the door, you'll see obviously we have the two front fans and also two bottom fans already pre-installed, and those are all set to intake. The front fans are quite nice because they have a mirror on them, so you've got an infinity mirror design there. You will notice a lot of the panels come off really easily, although there is no magnetic dust shields in there, just the standard shielding with the holes in it. But the front fans obviously have the infinity mirror and a pretty nice design to them. And I will say that with the standard fan setup, I found this PC ran nice and quiet. So if you want to stick with these fans, you'll end up with a really good looking system and a very straightforward build and a very quiet machine as well. We'll get to the thermal performance later on, but for the standard build I just kept these fans in and the standard bottom fans and then mounted the Hydroshift in there. Now if we strip the entire case down, I want to point out a few other things of interest here, because Lian Li has designed this case with some interesting highlights to it, and it is remarkably affordable for what you're getting as well, which is obviously also nice. There isn't a great deal of space at the back, but we'll get to that in a second. However, it's the little things that make the difference here, like this pre-installed Anti Sag Bracket. Now this is adjustable in 3 different positions, so you can actually move it forward or backwards in the case depending on the size of your graphics card. You can also adjust it up and down as well to account for that. But it's nice to have something simple like this included as standard to allow you to support your GPU and to prevent sag over time. Usually that's something you'd have to buy extra. There are some quirks here though. For example, obviously we have this extension cable that I mentioned that runs to the power supply unit, and I'll show you more of that in a second, but that does mean there's no power button on the rear of the case. At the back you'll see we have these Velcro ties for your cable management, and you can actually fit quite a lot of cables under there, but you can actually pull them apart in 3 different directions, meaning you can layer your cables in interesting ways if you want to. You'll notice there's a lack of hoops elsewhere in the case, so you can't really cable tie in other positions. But that doesn't really matter because all the channeling down here means you can easily run loads of cables through there and tidy it up. This is very narrow at the back though. I found, for example, that when I tried to use this Noctua controller on the back there, it was probably touching the door when trying to close the rear panel. So that's a bit of a problem, and I'll show you more of that in a second. Included in the box we have the accessories tray, which has everything you need for installing the parts in your case, and extras. So there's actually a load of extras included, which you don't really need. So it's nice to have those in case you lose bits, or something breaks, or you just need to replace things. Lots of things in here. The long fan screws, for example, for the front fans and the bottom fans, you don't really need them in a standard build, but they're there. Now in terms of SSDs and hard disk drive mounting, you have 2 plates that you can put your either SSDs or hard disk drives on. So you can only put 2 drives into this case, and they slot them at the bottom, just below those bottom fans that I showed you a minute ago. So storage is kind of limited, but that's not necessarily a problem, but it is worth bearing in mind. With the quirky design of the case and the way it holds the power supply unit, I thought it was worth showing a couple of different issues that I've had with it that you should probably know about if you're thinking about buying and building in it. I'm using here, for example, Corsair's RM Shift power supply unit, which is meant to put the cables towards the rear, but obviously when you're mounting it with the power cable towards the front, which is what you have to do here, this then puts the cable sideways which then means that you can't actually fit it into the case. So it just won't fit because the cables aren't going to fit in there properly. So obviously using a Lian Li power supply is a more logical thing to do here. So here we have the Edge PSU. Now Lian Li's guidance for this case actually suggests that you mount the power supply unit the other way up. So not the way I'm doing it now, which is the traditional way you'd mount a power supply with the fan facing downwards to pull air from below, but this way instead with the fan facing upwards, which is weird. I'm not quite sure why they've suggested that, I'll be honest. Now I thought it might be down to the way the cables work, because one of the issues I've had is with the two 8-pin CPU power cables for the motherboard. So these cables that you'd have to run to the top, the EPS power cables, what I found is they're very taut in this design. They're not meant to come from the left-hand side, they usually come from the right. So this has presented a bit of a problem. When you've installed the power supply unit and secured it on the bottom right-hand side of the case like this, the cables are then a bit short in terms of running to the top left of the motherboard. Now, I found this was problematic in both formats, so whether the power supply was mounted up or down. And what you can see here is I end up with a stretch across the case because of it, which I don't think is ideal. The other thing here is obviously you need to plug in this extension cable for your power supply, and the button for the power supply to turn it on and off is then hidden at the end of the build behind the grating, which is a bit strange and means you can't turn your PC on and off very easily. You can, however, easily mount a 360mm cooler to the top of the case, even when a rear fan's installed, as you'll see later on when I put a Noctua fan in there. So the Hydroshift will fit in there quite nicely, and obviously looks really nice along with the standard fans. Another small but useful feature of the case is the channeling for running your power supply cables for your graphics card. So this is just above the SSD trays down there, and towards the front of the case you can run the power cables through there, and there's a small hole at the front that you can pass them through. This means that you don't have to put them through weird angles and make them taut, but also that they don't get in the way of the bottom intake fans as well. Those intake fans have plenty of space down the bottom, as you can see. With the SSDs, there's a good gap between those and the fans, and the venting on the front and the rear means there's plenty of decent airflow down there for the GPU. So it gives good cooling there, and I'll show you the thermal performance of that later on. But the basic setup with the installers I've just done it is really straightforward, because basically all I've done is install the cooler at the top, and the standard fans are just already set up there and easy to connect. Then at the end you can just adjust the Anti Sag Bracket for the graphics card by screwing the screw at the rear and tightening and loosening it and moving it up and down into the relevant position and securing that nicely. And that definitely helps with keeping it nice and stable and supported. And then you've got a pretty nice looking build and a really straightforward one. The cabling for the fans is very simple because both the front and bottom fans are daisy chained together. There is one quirk here though, as I mentioned. When you go to put this bottom venting panel back on, you're obviously blocking the power supply, which means that you can't access the power button for it, which could be problematic if you ever want to turn your PC off directly at the mains, because you'd have to pull the cable out or turn it off at the wall. Now, as I said, I wanted to swap the fans out for Noctua's Chromax black fans. I've got a black case and a black motherboard, and I thought it might be interesting to create a complete stealth build, because I know not everybody likes RGB, and because the bottom fans of the case are already non-RGB, it shouldn't take too much effort. So I swapped out the Hydroshift fans for the Noctua Chromax Black 120mm, and I'm going to do a separate guide on wiring these fans and doing this sort of setup. If you're interested and want to find out more about that, subscribe if you haven't already to see it. But then I went about the installation of the fans in other locations, removing the bottom fans, for example, from the case. These two fans are connected together with one cable, and then there's another cable which then just runs to your motherboard and plugs into the system fan header. So really straightforward, simple wiring. And these fans are also effective, as you'll see from the thermal tests later on. They've got a lot of blades and they spin nice and quietly, but also give your GPU some good cooling performance. So you don't necessarily need to do what I'm doing. I just thought I would show how to do it and perhaps why you might like to. But doing so has helped me find some other quirks of the build. You'll see that these fans mount from above with the screws going through them, and you need to run the cables along the edges here. Now, because the Chromax Black fans aren't daisy chained together, they have one cable per fan, I had to run the cables along the very edge. So it meant I had to put the fans in a sort of wonky way with the labeling facing in different directions and the cabling running in different directions in order to be able to line up the fan holes with the screw holes in the case. And this is one little quirk of the design that isn't obvious, because you couldn't put the fans in the standard way because the adapters on them meant that they were blocking the ports. Now the cabling for these has to run to the rear or then to the motherboard and then plug into the system fan headers or chassis fan headers, and obviously it's going to be a lot more cables than there would be with the standard Lancool fans, and you then might end up with a controller like this instead. So some quirks there and maybe some complexities to doing it. Another complexity comes if you try and remove the front fans. So these are actually very nice fans, 140mm fans, once again fitted to the case with long screws that screw through the fan and into the case. You take them out, you'll see they're chained together, and they have two cables, one for 5V RGB header and one for the chassis fan header. I've done a separate build guide on the case, by the way, which shows you how to connect all these things up, that I'll link to in the description. But what I found was when trying to get these cables out for the fans to remove them, there was a problem. I couldn't get them through the hole. Then I discovered that you can just tug the front off and just pull that off, which I wasn't aware of, although it probably does show it in the manual. I didn't realise initially, because it's not something you have to do in a standard build. But if you want to get the front fans off, you have to pull this front fascia off in order to be able to access those cables. And this also secures all the front panel cables to it, because obviously your power button and the USB-C and USB-A cables run up to here, for example. So that's how that's held in place. Now, when taking the Chromax Black fans, I'm obviously going to put them in there, run the cabling through to the rear and try and plug them into either the fan controller or to the motherboard. But the problem here actually came a fair bit into doing this, and I think it's worth highlighting because you might have a similar issue if you're thinking about replacing the fans. So these are 140mm Noctua fans, so I thought they replaced like for like with the Lian Li fans that are already pre-installed. But what I found is when I went to screw them in, the screws, although they would screw in, were a problem because they're actually too long for the fan. So these fans, it turns out, are actually shallower than the standard Lian Li fans that are included in the case. If you put them side by side, you'll see there's more depth to the Lian Li fans, meaning that these screws don't go all the way through in the same way, so you have some wiggle in the fan, which is obviously not ideal because then you're going to get vibrations in it and it won't work very well. So I had to abandon my plans to use those Noctua fans on the front, and instead I just didn't plug in the RGB for those front fans instead, so you can see they're not lighting up anymore, but they're still spinning, so you can just opt to do that if you wanted to stealth build instead. And the other thing here is I found that with that fan controller on the rear panel, closing the door was pretty difficult. Now I had some problems with closing the door anyway, with the two 8-pin CPU power cables running to the top of the motherboard. Where I tried to tidy them up and bundle them together, this meant I actually couldn't push the door closed properly at the back, which is obviously a bit of a problem. I'm not happy with how those cables run anyway, because they're touching the back of the motherboard. Now, they are sealed, so it shouldn't be an issue, but I did find I had to undo the cable tidying in order to then be able to close the rear panel. Bit of a strange one. Another strange quirk came when I tried a different motherboard in the system as well. In the bottom right here, you'll see the USB-A connection is set down here instead of up near the 24-pin power connector. So this is a quirky motherboard design, which might be handy in some cases, but in this one is a problem because the rear mounting for the cabling that holds all your different cables together and gets them out of the way is then blocking the USB-A port, so you can't run the cable to the front and plug it in sideways on the side of the motherboard. One weird quirk, but now we're going to have a look at the standard build and the thermal performance of it and show you what that's like, and then I'll get into showing you the Chromax Black setup instead so we can compare the two. But generally speaking, for the most part, it's been a pretty straightforward build and ends up with a really nice looking machine if you're following the standard sort of setup and aren't going crazy or over the top with anything. Obviously, I don't have a rear exhaust fan here, for example, just the Hydroshift and the GPU and the standard wiring of all that. And with a tinted glass on the black model, it looks quite dark in there, but also has a nice subtle RGB glow to it, even through that venting on the front. So in order to test the standard setup, I first went about a few different tests, starting with Cinebench 2024. I'm running hardware info as well at the same time, but this is a thermal test with benchmarking the CPU, putting it under pretty heavy load to see how we got on. As a reminder, we've only got 3 exhaust fans on the radiator, but yet we're seeing some pretty good temperatures on the CPU, so we're not getting into the 90-degree mark on most of the cores at the maximum end during this test, which is pretty good. We've got 4 intake fans, 3 exhaust fans on the radiator, and yet the thermal performance of the CPU is decent. And also just generally the system performance as a whole seemed decent, and it didn't get loud. There's one thing I found is it wasn't obnoxiously loud, and that was very pleasing. So I then ran OCCT as well, similar sort of hour-long benchmark testing with it. You can see it got a little bit toastier here. The CPU average temperature was a bit higher, the maximum temperature was a bit higher, but still reasonable temperatures across the board and on the motherboard itself. Not insanely hot in any area that would concern me necessarily. And again, this is all while quietly performing nicely as well, so not too much of a problem there. Next up, we then ran Port Royal, which is obviously a stress test more for the GPU, but I wanted to see what the graphics performance was like with those bottom fans blowing onto it, especially considering they don't have access directly to the bottom of the case. And this test runs for quite some time because it's the stress test version of this, but you can see we're getting about 58 degrees maximum on the GPU here, which is actually a really good temperature. Now, obviously, I also wanted to test some general everyday world performance as well. So I did also jump in and use a game in a second, as you'll see, but we're looking at like 59 degrees maximum here on the GPU temperature, 64 on the memory junction. And so pretty good performance there. Now, while playing Escape from Tarkov on the maximum settings, I found it was probably about the same, somewhere in the 60-degree mark maximum, really. It wasn't getting too hot, it wasn't getting too loud. It was definitely a satisfying gaming experience from this. I haven't had any problems with the CPU or GPU performance generally, and the cooling seems pretty effective in the standard setup here. You can see from these clips it's 51 degrees currently with the GPU, so it's not too bad. It's pretty cool under pressure. But as mentioned, the fans are nice and quiet, and I think it's important to show this so you can hear it for yourself. So I'm going to be quiet for a second so you can hear what that was like when I was gaming, and then you'll get an idea of what the noise levels are like. As you can hear, that was pretty quiet because you could hear my keyboard and mouse clicks over the fan noise, which is impressive, but it's basically not that obnoxious. Now, with the Chromax Black fans, we obviously have an additional fan here and a much stealthier build. You can barely see what's going on inside the PC from this angle. But I ran the same test, starting with OCCT. Now, I want to note that this is a different motherboard. I had to use a different motherboard for some reasons, and I want to show you that basically the performance here was obviously marginally better. I'll get to that in a second, but obviously you have to take it with a pinch of salt because it's a completely different motherboard, an extra fan, and a slightly different setup here. But what you'll notice is to put the two temperatures side by side. On the left, we've got the original temps. On the right, we have the new ones. And you'll see that the cooler performed better with the Noctua fans on it, knocking a few degrees off across all the different cores. So it is better that way, but you do have to take it with a pinch of salt, because as I said, this is a different system. I had to reapply the thermal paste and more. But what I found is that it does run cooler and yet is still nice and quiet as well. So if you want to do it, you can. But I will say the standard fans still do give good performance, but I thought it was worth showing you the performance difference here as well. And we'll do that too with the Cinebench. Although this is the same CPU, it is worth bearing in mind that it is a different motherboard. So you have to bear that in mind if you're looking at the scores in Cinebench. Instead, I want to focus on the temperatures, which you'll see are actually lower with the Noctua fans. We do have an extra Noctua fan in here, obviously, but also the temperatures are quite a bit lower. So if I put them side by side, you'll see the original fans on the left, Noctua on the right. You can see we've got a significant difference here with the average temperature being lower, but also the core temperatures being lower as well. So once again, doing the same stress test as well with Port Royal, because I wanted to see how we got on with the GPU performance, because obviously I've changed the fans right below the graphics card. So it's worth checking out to see if that made any difference. And once again, you can see the overall scores here, and actually the temperatures are just below 60 degrees during the testing. So it was still running about the same temperature, very cool and quiet. And that was one of the things I noted during both setups, that it runs quietly with Noctua Fans and with the standard fans installed in the case. So the end conclusion is this is a great case with a number of caveats, a few little weird problems along the way, some of which you might not have, but hopefully I've highlighted some of the things of interest. It is an affordable case that comes with multiple fans that are more than capable. And if you're using just a couple of SSDs, you can create a really good build here. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Thanks very much for watching. Don't forget to check out the links in the description to find out more and see related content. You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.